If you push a wrestler at the right time, it can lead to great things for everyone involved. Just take Vince McMahon's decision to go all in with Hulk Hogan in 1984, for example, or WCW's capitalization on the Goldberg phenomenon in 1998. That said, not all pushes lead to places as great as this. No, sometimes they fail so hard they go completely forgotten to time after the fact. But what are the biggest examples of such a phenomenon in action? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with Mike Knox's botched rise to the top in 2006? Because pretty quickly after he made his debut on WWECW in June of that year, he showed himself to be an absolute charisma vacuum. Sure, it didn't help that his first real role on the show was to feud with CM Punk, as Punk, for all his other flaws, has always been a man with a commanding presence, and so standing next to him, the San Bernardino native was obviously going to look inferior by comparison. And it also didn't help that this was the period he was given the task of stopping his on-screen girlfriend Kelly from performing a striptease every week too, a decision which didn't exactly endear him to fans. Still, even if we ignore these hurdles, it wasn't as if Mike Knox was likely to make a big splash anyway, as truthfully, he just didn't have what it took to be a player on a major level. And this was never more evident than when he made an appearance at Survivor Series later that year during a 5-on-5 elimination match, and immediately got made to look like a jobber when Shawn Michaels super kicked him into oblivion, then asked his buddy Triple H, who was that? So needless to say, after this incident, any hopes that Knox would be able to build momentum were washed away, and people started to forget he ever existed, even as he was still on the roster. But it could have been worse, because for as bad as he was, and as forgotten as he later became, you could argue his run in WWECW still pales in comparison when put up against just how terrible Sylvester Turis's run in 2006 and 2007 was. Forgotten who Sylvester Turis is? Well, we don't blame you. But then, how couldn't you forget a guy who, despite being 6'6" and 330 pounds, still managed to disappear into the background whenever he appeared on screen? And what makes this one even more damning for the Pennsylvania native is that he wasn't always a part of the WWECW brand. No, during his early weeks on the roster, he actually appeared on SmackDown, though to be fair, these appearances were so brief and meaningless that they may as well not have happened at all. Why were they so meaningless? Well, even if he was made to look strong by being booked to mow through a series of jobbers, Turis was constantly overshadowed by the man he was serving as a heavy for, Elijah Burke. But that didn't stop WWE from trying this method of rehabilitation anyway, when they moved the big man over to WWECW on November 7th of that year, with him there continuing to serve as the backup for Burke, as they started referring to themselves as the Knockout Tap-Out Connection. Of course, whether they were aiming to knock someone out or tap them out mattered little in the end, because neither method saw them get over with fans. And because of that, come January 18th of 2007, the whole Sylvester Turis experiment would be put out of its misery when he was released from his contract, and his time with WWE was allowed to slip into the forgotten part of history. But even this might not be the worst WWECW run of them all when it comes to something which has largely disappeared from memory in the years since. And that's because in 2007, someone arguably more forgettable made his debut on the once Extreme brand, Gene Snitsky. Of course, what makes this one worse is that there appeared to be a real attempt to make Snitsky stand out once he joined the Extreme roster in February of that year. So much so that all the hair on his head and face was shaved off, and his teeth were colored a dark yellow in order to make him look more grotesque than ever. Sadly though, this did little to help the Pennsylvania native in the end, as despite the makeover, when you got down to it, he was still the same old guy who'd been stinking up the Raw roster over the years prior with his awful "it wasn't my fault" gimmick. Yes, even on his best day, Gene Snitsky was never someone you'd exactly call good, but things only seemed to get worse for him after he got involved in feuds with the likes of ECW originals Balls Mahoney and Rob Van Dam. And that was because they outshone him so much during their matches together, you'd be forgiven for forgetting the big man was even there at points. Honestly, it may as well have been a ghost taking his place for the most part, because the ghost would have probably made a bigger impact. And perhaps that's why, in June of 2007, WWE decided to pull the plug on the entire experiment when they drafted Snitsky back over to Raw, and there, allowed him to fall into obscurity on a bigger stage. That's right, back in the mid-2000s, even if you weren't locked in with the C brand and instead had the opportunity to appear in front of a larger audience every week, you could still go forgotten by fans if you didn't give them enough to make them care. Hell, this was pretty much the foundation of the SmackDown Tag Team division at this point. But it wasn't just tag team acts who were busy getting memory hold. No, the singles division also had its fair share of this too. And if you want a prime example of that, you need to look no further than Gunner Scott. But then it's not like either Brent Albright, the man behind the character, or WWE themselves ever gave us any reason to remember this one. No, if anything, they seem to be actively trying to mind wipe us on the whole thing at times. How else could you explain the absolutely abysmal decision to have him pin Booker T during his SmackDown debut on April 7, 2006, and be praised by Chris Benoit backstage after the fact, only to then be shipped off back down to Ohio Valley Wrestling a couple of months later in June? It really doesn't make any sense, does it? After all, if you're going to go all in on someone, you really should do this and not just give up on them after a matter of weeks have passed. All that's going to achieve is to pretty much guarantee no one will remember the person in question at all after a while. And it's certainly not going to do them any good when their last match before they go back to developmental is a losing effort against Mr. Kennedy, a match which was made even worse by the fact that, after the bell had rung and things were over, the Great Khali came down to the ring to destroy Scott and stuff him into a body bag. That's right, it was quite a burial, so perhaps it shouldn't have come as a surprise that the big man was released from his contract altogether later that year. One person on the roster around the same time who it did surprise people when they got released, however, was Nidia. And that's because prior to her forgotten run on Raw in 2004, it looked like WWE were all in on her as one of their next top female stars. That said, it was in their best interests to think this way as, alongside Maven, Nidia had been one of the two winners of the first season of Tough Enough. So if the company wanted to make the reality TV show look like it really could lead to a rookie finding big-time success in New York, then they'd need to give the victors every opportunity to succeed. But while this did work for a little while, as Maven got a singles push on Raw and Nidia took up a memorable role as the valet and on-screen girlfriend to Jamie Noble over on SmackDown, come 2004, things were starting to change for the worse for both parties. And in the case of Nidia specifically, this meant her being separated from Noble and moved over to the Red brand, where any elements of the trailer park trash aspects of her gimmick, which made her interesting, were pretty much washed away. Yes, while on the Blue brand, the Houston native had at least been given something to work with, Monday nights would instead see her be reduced to being little more than a creator wrestler. So obviously then, this wasn't enough to make her stand out, just as her matches against the likes of Molly Holly, Gail Kim, and Jazz weren't enough to draw fans' eyes towards her. And that was why, after a run you'd be hard-pressed to find any memory of today amongst current-day fans, Nidia was cut from her contract in November of that year, leaving her to go out on the indies for a period before she retired altogether in 2005. But we've talked a lot about forgotten pushes which took place under the WWE banner today, so let's shift gears for a while and instead move over to another company. A company who also had their fair share of botched attempts to make someone a star. And of the people they failed to get over during the dark days of 1999 and 2000, perhaps none were more prominent than Tank Abbott. Sure, you could argue Abbott should have been a shoo-in to be a major player in the Southern Wrestling Company, as prior to signing on the dotted line with them, he'd found a fair bit of success in UFC as an MMA fighter. Unfortunately though, as he'd soon discover, being good in a shoot fight doesn't necessarily mean you're necessarily going to be good in a scripted one, as the two skill sets are almost entirely different in their nature. And this was exactly why, despite WCW, and Vince Russo in particular, doing everything they could to push Abbott to the top during the dying days of the company, fans never really gravitated towards him, as it was clear the Huntington Beach native simply wasn't taking to the squared circle the way many had hoped he would. Not that this stopped Russo himself from pitching that the cage fighter win the world title in early 2000 though, a suggestion which was so poorly received on account of Tank Abbott's limited skills, it ultimately led to the infamous Booker being removed from the creative team for a time. So if he wasn't good enough for the main event, then what was Abbott good enough for? Well, the answer to that, as it turned out, was the dreaded comedy dancing role, because as the year went on, he ended up sliding into complete irrelevance when he became an honorary member of 3 Count, WCW's boy band parody stable. That's right, it's a period best left forgotten, so thankfully most have done just this, with few ever really thinking about Tank Abbott and his time down south anymore. And he's not the only former WCW performer whose run there was so meh it's seemingly been erased from time, as years prior to this, back in 1996, Roadblock was having the exact same problem. But wait, we hear you ask, who was Roadblock? Well, he was another one who's since been severely memory holed by fans. Of course, exist he did though, and what's more, he was actually around for much of the boom period of the Ted Turner-owned company. Seriously, by the time Joseph DeKisto, the man behind the gimmick, made his debut with WCW in October of 1996, they were already exploding into the mainstream with the success of the NWO angle. So you'd think this would make for a perfect place for the up-and-comer to get himself over with fans in a very big way then, right? Except it wouldn't, because with a gimmick which pretty much amounted to him bringing a sawhorse down to the ring then proceeding to lose to a far better opponent, there was little hope this one was going to catch on. No, in the end, all it did was bury the character. And it wouldn't be long before Roadblock was demoted to B shows like Saturday Night and WCW Pro, even if he, at points, managed to share the ring with the likes of Chris Benoit, Diamond Dallas Page, and the scariest man in all of wrestling, Ming. Of course, if you have trouble remembering a character as obscure as Roadblock, then you're really going to have trouble recalling our next performer and their failed push. Not only because it happened all the way back in 1989, but because it was sandwiched in between two halves of a legendary career. Who are we talking about here? Why, who else but Barry Windham's run in WWF as the Widowmaker. Yes, even being a Hall of Famer, a member of arguably the greatest stable in wrestling history, and a former NWA World's Champion doesn't make you exempt from having a run so forgettable, it's basically disappeared from time at this point. And what makes this one hurt all the more is that Windham was still very much in his prime at the time Vince McMahon gave him the Widowmaker gimmick to play. Hell, he'd only just come off his first run with the Four Horsemen when he started it. So surely, he should have been able to use his athleticism and charisma to knock this out of the park then? Well, no, because as it turns out, even the Sweetwater native wasn't good enough to get it over, as despite pretty much playing himself under a new name, there just wasn't enough time for fans of the New York company to get to know him. Why was that? Well, after going undefeated for his first 4 months there, Windham abruptly left WWF when his family were implicated in a counterfeiting scandal, and he was deemed too toxic to handle at that moment in time. Sure, if things had been different and he hung around for longer, then maybe he would have been a bigger star there, perhaps even someone important enough to challenge Hulk Hogan or the Ultimate Warrior at some point. But alas, fate just didn't have this on the cards for him, and so instead, his first WWF run will go down as probably the most forgotten part of his career. That said, at least he's not alone in this, because a couple of years earlier in 1987, Bam Bam Bigelow found himself in a very similar situation during his initial go-round with the Fed. That's right, while his more famous period in New York during the early 90s saw Bam Bam go as far as the main event WrestleMania 11 with Lawrence Taylor, this wasn't actually his first shot at being under Vince McMahon's employ. No, that happened during the decade prior, as it was then, after impressing the right people in his early runs in both the Continental Wrestling Association and World Class Championship Wrestling, he was given the opportunity to join WWF and earn more money than he could have ever dreamed of. And we're not being melodramatic when we say this, because Bam Bam wasn't going to be treated like any other mid-carder after he made the jump in May of 1987. No, he was pretty quickly going to be rocketed up to the main event scene. Hell, he'd even find himself being aligned with Hulk Hogan as part of a tag team on the house show circuit for a while, and when he wasn't doing that, his singles competition opponents ranged from folks like the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase to others such as Andre the Giant. So really, this entire run should be more fondly remembered than it is, especially as Bigelow also got a big win at the 1987 Survivor Series when he was the only man in his team to go the distance against the heel faction of King Kong Bundy, Ravishing Rick Rude, the One-Man Gang, Butch Reed, and Andre the Giant. Why is it so forgotten today then? Maybe it's because it all got overshadowed by his later run, or maybe it's because this one was so short overall, with Bigelow being gone from the company by June of 1988 as a result of injuries and heat he'd developed with other performers on the roster. Whatever the reason, the fact remains you'd be hard-pressed to think of someone who would go to this one first nowadays when asked to name a time the Beast from the East worked in New York, as there's simply not enough meat on the bone to remember it instead of the more famous period he'd have later on down the line. When it comes to our next subject though, well, they had the exact opposite problem, because while their initial run in WWF was legendary, their second go-round in 1995 wasn't so successful. Who are we talking about this time? Why, King Kong Bundy, of course. But let's rewind for a moment, because it's important to give some context as to why it's such a big deal that Bundy's 90s run under Vince McMahon failed so spectacularly. After all, this wasn't someone who'd come into the company then as a nobody. No, this was a former WrestleMania main eventer. And he wasn't just that either, because between 1985 and 1988, right at the height of the Golden Era, he'd be pushed as an absolute monster heel, one who regularly went up against big-name babyfaces such as Big John Studd, Tony Atlas, or Macho Man Randy Savage. Of course, his real claim to fame came after this though, as it was in 1986 he main evented WrestleMania 2 in a steel cage match against Hulk Hogan. Something which brought him so much notoriety, he was able to segue it into a brief career on TV when he guest starred in the hit show Married with Children. So it's just unfortunate then that only a couple of years after he'd enter semi-retirement and pretty much disappear from the spotlight entirely, all the way up until his return in 1994. And we're sure that you can already figure out by now, once he did return at this point, it wasn't the same company he left behind anymore. No, we were now firmly in the new generation era, an era where larger-than-life figures were being forced to make way for smaller, more athletic performers such as Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. And this meant, once he stepped in the ring again in the autumn of that year, Bundy managed to stand out like a sore thumb as he was quite simply someone from a bygone part of history trying desperately to still appear relevant. But no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't regain what it was that had once made him so special. It didn't matter if he was joining up with Ted DiBiase's $1 Million Corporation or challenging The Undertaker at WrestleMania 11, the magic wasn't there anymore. Hell, this was clearly evident during his appearance in the 1995 Royal Rumble where, despite being pegged as a favorite to win the whole thing ahead of time, he'd end up getting eliminated in 3 minutes after being unable to keep up with the other, younger, and more talented wrestlers in the ring with him. And this notion of being unable to keep up with other, more talented performers around you is one of the reasons our next subject also failed to make much of an impact when they got their big push in 2020. But then when we're talking about Tamina Snuka, someone who was never on the level of a Mercedes Moné or an Io Sky, perhaps that shouldn't come as a surprise. Now, we don't mean this to be a burial of Tamina when we say that, as she did serve a role in WWE prior, usually as a heavy to other women on the roster like AJ Lee or Lana. And this was a perfect role for her as it happened because it meant she could come in for a big power spot at the end of a bout, but was never relied upon to carry the whole thing. Of course, that would all change in 2020 though, the year we'd all like to forget ever happened, because at this point, WWE decided to push her as a more serious singles performer for the first time in years, which was exactly what led to her getting shots at the SmackDown Women's title, not only during a fatal 5-way match at WrestleMania 36, but also in a singles bout against then-champion Bayley at May 10th's Money in the Bank. Would the Washington native be able to take any of these opportunities by the horns and win the title? No, and she also wouldn't win once she got a chance to gain another shot at the same belt at SummerSlam in August. Hell, even moving her over to Raw at this point wouldn't do much good because there, after entering a battle royal to become #1 contender to the Raw Women's title, she'd be eliminated in short order. No, the reality was that for as much as WWE wanted to make Tamina a thing here, it just wasn't going to happen, as she was swimming upstream against the incredible level of talent already on the roster. And because of that then, her big push has pretty much disappeared from everyone's collective memory.